Picture yourself walking into a car dealership in 1964 where the windows have been painted over for weeks and nobody knows what's inside. There's a party happening and people are dressed up, waiting for the moment when they finally pull that cover off the new model. When they do, grown men are gasping while women applaud, and some people are actually getting emotional over a car. The people who built these cars understood something about human psychology that most people still don't get today. Because Detroit in the 1960s didn't just build cars, they built identity, status, and dreams you could park in your driveway by studying exactly how your mind works and exploiting every weakness they found. The man who started all of this was Harley Earl, who ran design at General Motors for 3 decades and understood one fundamental truth about human nature, which is that people don't buy transportation, they buy attention and the feeling of being noticed. His successor Bill Mitchell later described the design philosophy with what he called the schoolyard test, where if you drive a car past a schoolyard and the kids don't whistle, you go back to the drawing board. Earl understood that chrome was the key to perceived value. Under his leadership, GM designers piled on the bright work until cars looked like gleaming chariots, because Earl knew that a car covered in chrome looked expensive even when it wasn't. Your brain saw that shine and automatically assumed quality, which was psychological manipulation built into the sheet metal. The fins, those massive tailfins that defined the entire era, came from a very specific place when a designer named Frank Hershey spotted a Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter plane at an airbase and noticed that those twin tail rudders gave the aircraft identity from behind, meaning you could recognize it from any angle. Hershey brought that idea back to Earl, and suddenly cars had what Earl called rear identity, which meant that for the first time, you could tell a Cadillac from behind and be recognized driving away, not just arriving. Those fins weren't about aerodynamics and did absolutely nothing for performance because they were purely about symbolism. America was in the middle of the Cold War while the space race was heating up and Russians had just launched Sputnik, leaving Americans feeling terrified and proud all at once. So Detroit gave them rocket ships for the road. The 1959 Cadillac Eldorado had fins that stood 42 inches tall with parking light pods lifted directly from B-52 bomberjet intakes, which meant that when you drove that car you weren't just going to work, you were commanding American power and piloting your own spacecraft. General Motors had a strategy they politely called dynamic obsolescence, because the head of GM, Alfred Sloan, figured out that the real enemy wasn't Ford or Chrysler, the real enemy was satisfaction. If customers were happy with what they had, they'd stop buying, so the goal became making people feel like their perfectly good car was suddenly outdated. Not broken, not worn out, just unfashionable. The goal of dynamic obsolescence was simple. Make people feel compelled to buy a new car every year, not because they needed to, but because their neighbor just pulled up in next year's model and suddenly their car looked old. They created an entire psychological ladder to keep you climbing your whole life. You start with a Chevrolet when you're young and broke, then as your career improves you move to Pontiac, then Oldsmobile, then Buick, and finally when you've made it, you drive a Cadillac. Every brand existed to make you feel like you weren't quite there yet, because there was always one more rung to reach for. They called it the ladder of success, and it kept people buying until the day they died. The real mastermind behind the psychology wasn't even a car guy, he was a psychologist from Vienna named Ernest Dichter, who fled Europe as the Nazis rose to power and ended up revolutionizing American advertising. Dichter did something nobody had done before by asking why, not what people bought, but why they bought it. Dichter studied car buyers for Chrysler and discovered that men talked about horsepower and handling, but that's not what they actually cared about. Deep down, they saw cars as extensions of themselves, where a sedan was like a wife who was practical, sensible, and reliable, but a convertible was like a mistress who was exciting, youthful, and a little bit dangerous. Most men couldn't actually buy the convertible, but they wanted to, so Dichter told Chrysler to put convertibles front and center in every showroom. The idea was to let men fall in love with the fantasy, then guide them to the sedan, because they'd buy the practical choice, but feel like they'd touched something exciting. The sale happened because of emotion, not logic. Dichter called his mission creating constructive discontent, because he wanted Americans to feel perpetually unsatisfied, always wanting the next thing, and always feeling like what they had wasn't quite enough. The entire consumer economy of the 1960s ran on this principle. Then came 1964, when the baby boomers were coming of age. 40% of America was about to be under 20 years old, and these kids had money their parents never had at that age since they'd grown up in prosperity instead of depression, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with their father's Buick. John DeLorean at Pontiac understood this perfectly and followed the philosophy of his mentor Bunky Knudsen, who said that you can sell a young man's car to an old man, but you can never sell an old man's car to a young man. So DeLorean created the GTO, a muscle car with raw power in a mid-size body. Pontiac expected to sell maybe 5,000, but they sold over 32,000 in the first year alone. Lee Iacocca at Ford did the same thing with the Mustang, but added another layer of psychology through personalization. The Mustang came with endless options, so you could make it a little economy car or a roaring sports machine, the same body with a completely different personality. Young buyers didn't just want a car, they wanted their car, something that expressed who they were instead of who their parents expected them to be. Iacocca called it 3 cars in one, and it became the most successful automotive launch in history. The psychology behind these muscle cars was primal, because when you turned the key and that big block V8 rumbled to life, you felt it in your chest, and you felt powerful, in control, and free. These weren't just transportation, they were therapy for a generation watching their friends get drafted to Vietnam, rebellion against corporate conformity, and identity forged in horsepower. For years, cars came in soft pastels like seafoam green and coral pink, gentle colors for gentle times. But by 1969, Chrysler introduced what they called high-impact paint with names like Plum Crazy, Go Mango, Panther Pink, and Sublime Green, so bright it almost hurt to look at. In a decade of assassinations and protests and a war nobody understood, choosing a plum-crazy purple Roadrunner was an act of defiance that screamed you refused to blend in and still believed in something bold when everything felt like it was falling apart. Bill Mitchell, who replaced Harley Earl at GM, wanted cars that looked like they were going fast, even standing still. So he studied sharks and how their bodies conveyed speed and power, and he studied greyhounds because he wanted that same predatory energy translated into sheet metal. His cardinal aesthetic virtue was what he called flair, and his designer Chuck Jordan put it best when he declared that they were in the emotion business. Mitchell understood that when you pull up somewhere, people make instant judgments about whether you're successful, whether you're interesting, and whether you're someone worth knowing, and your car answered those questions before you ever opened your mouth. This psychological engineering in the 1960s didn't just sell cars, it shaped how Americans think about identity itself. The idea that what you own defines who you are, the idea that you can buy your way to a better version of yourself, and the idea that there's always something newer and better that you need to be complete. Detroit didn't invent these ideas, but they perfected them and turned them into science. The muscle car era ended in the early 70s when insurance costs skyrocketed, emissions regulations strangled horsepower, and the oil embargo made gas guzzlers look foolish. But the psychology they pioneered never went away, it just moved to other products like phones, clothes, and watches, all using the same playbook of creating desire, engineering dissatisfaction, and building ladders people spend their lives climbing. Those cars from the 60s show you the blueprint, where every tailfin, every chrome strip, and every rumbling V8 was calculated to make you feel something specific. Once you understand how that worked, you start seeing it everywhere in every product designed to make you feel inadequate, in every upgrade cycle that never ends, and in every purchase that promises to finally make you feel complete but never quite does. The men who designed those cars were geniuses, but what they were engineering wasn't just automobiles, it was the American relationship with wanting itself. And 60 years later, we're still driving on the roads they built.